Hey guys, this week we're talking about range of motion and the specific adaptations that come with them. High squats and deep squats each have adaptations, therefore, each have their place in a strength conditioning program. We're going to talk about why full range of motion doesn't strengthen all joints equally. And then we're talking about the stimuli for the various adaptations resulting from each specific range of motion. So we're going to look at changes in optimum muscle length for maximum force reduction. We're talking about the specific hypertrophy gains, or regional hypertrophy, you might call it later. Neural drive is maximized at joint angles experiencing the greatest mechanical loading, and we'll talk about what those actual adaptations are, parameters and key takeaways, and then we're going to talk about the possible transfer to sport. Some key points. Specificity is key. We're going to say that probably every single time. I don't know where there'll ever be a moment where that's not important. So for example, partial range of motion exercises gets an athlete better at creating force with a partial range of motion. Full range of motion gets you better at creating force at a full range of motion. We're going to understand the physiology of the body, which uncovers the cause of each of those specific adaptations. Each range of motion leads to specific adaptations. We'll talk about what those are. And then we're going to learn to match the range of motion to the adaptation specific to the individual needs, to the sport you're playing, to the genetic needs of the individual. Now let's get into the science of all this. So full range of motion doesn't strengthen or create growth equally. The adaptations depend on the external resistance that you're experiencing, the moment arm, and the length of muscle during maximum resistance. So if you look down here in the little diagram, so in the one where it's obviously a squat, you have the barbell. So that's how much weight is on the barbell is important. And remember, that won't change throughout the range of motion. You just take the mass times the 9.81 meters per second squared, the acceleration of gravity. But then, as you move throughout a range of motion, things do change. And moment arm is simply the distance. See, let's say at the hip or at the knee, we're looking at the perpendicular distance from that joint to the line of action of the force. So like where the barbell is. So right here, when the person is at, when they're at parallel the squat, that's when things are maximized. The distance between the hip and the line of action is the farthest, and so is it at the knee. Now, as they stand up, that distance will shorten. Therefore, even though the weight doesn't change, it gets easier at the hip. So by the time they're at lockout, it's super easy. That's why when people, squat high, they do that because they can do more weight, because they don't maximize the range of motion. Therefore, they don't maximize the moment arm at the hip nor the knees. So, and then the length of the muscle during the maximum resistance. So when the muscle is obviously fully lengthened, not only is it where, like seeing the squat, not only are you maximized because of the moment arm, you're also maximized because the hip, the quads, for example, are fully lengthened, and therefore it's harder for the muscles to create force. So it's even more of a resistance, because remember the length tension relationship. The muscles are the strongest, or have the ability to create the most cross bridges between myosin and actin, somewhere in the middle. When they're fully lengthened, which we'll see in a minute, they can't. The myosin and actin can't cause a cross bridge, but when they're fully shortened, they're bunched up, so they can't create any more of those cross bridges. So anyway, so full range of motion movements, depend on the moment arm and load to stress the muscles. Partial range of motions must rely heavily on increasing the resistance. So because when if you want to do partial squats and get the athlete stronger in that shorter range of motion, you're going to have to increase the load, because it's going to be easier, because you're not going to have the biggest moment arms. So keys to determining joint angle experiencing maximum required force. So torque, that's measured in Newton meters, is force times the moment arm. And that's just a look at torque really is just a rotational force. That's what you're looking at. And in the body, you're going to have, or today we're going to talk about internal moment arms, which is the muscle, actually. It's the where the tendon attaches, where it crosses the joint and attaches. And we're also going to look at external moment arms. So that's where the load is. Say if you have a barbell in someone's hands, it's the distance between the barbell and that joint, perpendicular to that line of force. So when you're looking at mechanical advantage, you look at how far that tendon crosses the joint, how far the moment arm created at the tendon versus the moment arm created by where the barbell is in their hand. So, we're normally operating at a mechanical disadvantage. So if you look at like over here, I've given you examples. So when you're doing like a bicep curl and the barbell is in your hand, so the distance between where the barbell is and that the axis of the joint that's rotating versus where the tendon crosses and the joint rotating, you're definitely a mechanical disadvantage. Therefore, your muscle is going to have to create way more force than the forces being created by the barbell and gravity, if that makes sense. Now, when you're doing a calf raise, which is why we can calf raise a ton of weight, that's one of the few times you're actually acting at a mechanical advantage. Because if you look at where the axis is, the pivot is somewhere right at the ball of the foot, and where the line of force is going to be down in the middle. So actually, for once, the moment arm where the joint attaches or where the gastrocnemius attaches it's a bigger moment arm than where the barbell crosses. So it's actually, for once, we have mechanical advantage. So those are all going to be very important as we talk about where at what points are is force going to be maximized. You got to know the moment arm. You want to look at the internal moment arms versus external moment arms, and you're going to have to look at the force that your body's creating versus the force that's being acted on it. So anyway, I hope that wasn't too confusing. I was super understanding. Also when you think about it too, things change too throughout a range of motion. So when a person starts to curl, do a bicep curl, at first, it's super easy, but by the time it's at 90 degrees, the moment arm is maximized, as far as the external resistance. But it's also changing too, the moment arm where the bicep, crosses the elbow and attaches, it's also maximized. But still, you're at a mechanical disadvantage. And that's where it's maximized when it's at 90 degrees. So it gets easier, as you get lower, but it also gets easier upon lockout. So that's why when people do 21s in curls, it's a great way to maximize force being produced, in elbow flexion. Adaptations responsible for increases in force and production in force production specific to joint angle. So squatting high gets an athlete really good at squatting high. Squatting low gets athletes really good at squatting low. So why? You get changes in optimum muscle length for maximum force production. Remember that length tension relationship. You're also going to get specific hypertrophy gains specific to if you're doing partials, you're going to get regional hypertrophy specific to those partials. So it's not going to be the same type of hypertrophy you get when you do full. And we're going to talk about what this looks like when you do a full range of motion, say squat. Neural drive is always going to be maximized at joint angles experiencing max mechanical loading. So wherever you're producing, wherever your joint is experiencing the most force to overcome, that's where you're going to get the most neural drive. By neural drive, you're going to be motor unit. We're talking about motor unit recruitment, rate coding, those two things, which we've talked a lot about in this series. Chris Beardsley does a great job, and a lot of the information I'm going to give you today is straight from his books, Strength is Specific. So go check it out. Plus, he's a great coach. Anyway, a lot has to do with the addition and possibly the subtraction of sarcomeres. And so we'll talk about that over here as a look at sarcomeres, myosin, actin. All right, so the change in optimum muscle length for maximum force production. Sarcomeres, that's the actin myosin. They got to create cross bridges. They're responsible for active force production. So when a muscle is too lengthened and no cross bridges can be, then no cross bridges can be formed. When it's too short, they're pushed up against each other. If you look at this little chart down here, which we've in this series we've talked about quite a bit, here where the force production is maximized for a sarcomere. It's like kind of right in the middle. So the maximum amount of cross bridges are formed, and as it shortens, there's less amount of cross bridges that can be formed. Here, they're just bunched up, so nothing else can happen. As the muscle gets lengthened, there's fewer of these cross bridges are possible to where down here, but remember this too, even though active force production is at its low, total force production is at its high because of passive force, which is, the muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organ, all those things we've talked about, and elastic components. Anyway, so most muscle fibers adapt specifically to the imposed demands. So the full range of motion movements experiencing maximum resistance at those end ranges experience hypertrophy regionally at the ends of the muscle. So now we're getting specific into what types of hypertrophy. And normally it appears consistent with sarcomeres being added in series, meaning like a chain. It's getting long, it's getting longer and longer, which means that allowing sarcomeres to be shorter any given fiber length, since the length doesn't change. The length of the muscle fiber never changes. So when you add, sarcomeres in series, that means no matter how long the muscle is, the least amount of lengthening is going to happen at the sarcomere, meaning they're able to produce more max force. So, because if they weren't as many in series, that means when the muscle is completely lengthened, then each sarcomere is maximized being lengthened, and then you have this problem of not being able to create cross bridges. So the adaptation from full range of motion is more in series, creating more cross bridges at this full length of motion. So in a shorter range of motion, sarcomeres are bunched up and they're unable to produce the force, like I said. So overloading movements, like in squats, in a partial range of motion, sarcomeres, number one, they're lost in series and or added in parallel. So they get super strong. And once again, now the optimal length for max force is at shorter range of motion. That's that adaptation. So now, like I said, when you do a lot of like partial range of motion, you get really good at force production at that short range of motion. But then you get really weak because the reason you get weak at now a lengthened range of motion is because you've lost those sarcomeres in series and you've added them in parallel. So now when you're fully lengthened, the cross bridges can't be formed because they're not long enough. You don't have as many in series, and so they're completely stretched out and they can't create cross bridges. So now you get optimal length is at the shorter range of motion. So hope that made sense. All right, let's talk about regional hypertrophy gains. The regional hypertrophy adaptation isn't fully understood, but most researchers believe that hypertrophy experience at the end of muscles from full range of motion exercises is likely sarcomeres being added in the series, which I've already kind of alluded to. A regional hypertrophy from partial range of motion movements is probably from sarcomeres being added in parallel. So you get stronger at the shorter range of motions because it optimizes that length tension relationship of the sarcomeres. To be clear, a full range of motion, exercise maximizes overall hypertrophy. So you're going to gain overall more hypertrophy. However, it's just going to be based on those moment arms that we talked about as to where that will be maximized. So, but yet later I will explain the benefits of regional hypertrophy for improving specific athletic endeavors. Neural drive is maximized at joint angles, experiencing maximum mechanical loading. So maximum motor unit recruitment and increases in rate coding are directly related to the joint angle experiencing the maximum mechanical loading. Therefore, when you load up the barbell and you do those partial squats, whether it's quarter squats or half squats, now those in range of motion are finally being overloaded, where they won't be if you just always do full range of motion squats. But most of the increased ability to produce force is at shortened range of motions are neural gains. You're recruiting more of these. You're getting better at synchronization, meaning more than one. So you're getting more of the motor units all at once being recruited, and the rate of that signal is getting faster, which is awesome because this makes the type of training even more important for athletic ability, sprinting, jumping, etc. Because they're not going to get a lot of hypertrophy. You're definitely not going to get as much hypertrophy from those partials, but you're going to get the increases in ability and rates of force development at those angles that are specific to like sprinting. And so when we talk about joint angles, you're thinking about when your foot strikes the ground, what is the angle at the knee? What is the angle at the hip? It's not going to be that extreme range as when you're doing a full squat. So this is a little bit, easier to understand, like sarcomeres. When added in length, now there's more, and it makes it looks longer. So remember, the muscle fiber itself doesn't change length, but if you're adding the sarcomeres, in like a chain factor, when your muscle is fully lengthened, these sarcomeres aren't as maximized in length. Therefore, more cross bridges can be formed. And in parallel, they're more side by side. So, and so then stay with. Here's what my parameters and key takeaways are. I use this a lot. This is us in Jamaica working with the best sprinters in the entire world. As we all know, Jamaica puts out arguably the best 100 meter, 200 meter, and 400 meter sprinters in the world. They have for quite some time. So getting to work with them really helped me, really understand what it takes to be fast. And so it's way different, the types of adaptations you need for that versus like this is me when I was powerlifting, and the adaptations needed for that to look like that versus to look like that. So uh, here are some suggestions. Stay with the full range of motion movements until a base level of strength is achieved, somewhere between 1.7 to 2 times body weight. I'm going to give you my personal opinion. I'm thinking 2 to 2.2 because some of the studies that would say 1.7, the people they've been done on are like, the average student body. And it appears, if you look at most sprinters, especially world class, they're all going to be somewhere like this or stronger. So, but never abandon full range of motion movements either. I'm not definitely not saying that because you're working with sprinters, because the neuromuscular junction adaptations, like the muscle spindles, that you're going to maximize muscle spindle activity. So therefore, passive force production is going to be maximized with a full range of motion. You're going to improve elasticity by strengthening tendons. Those structures that are there to prevent stretching. So you're going to get the tendons are going to be stronger, connective tissue overall. So, and then maintain mobility, especially when it comes to the moment of inertia from the recovery leg during sprints. If you watch these guys when they're sprinting, or we can go back one, and you'll see, see how his heel is right by his butt as he's bringing his leg through. Because remember, the moment of inertia is all about length. So the shorter that moment arm is when you bring it through, the lighter it is, therefore the faster you can bring it through. So you don't want to lose range of motion. I'm definitely not saying that. I recommend full range of motion and partial range of motion in all the different. See, those dudes are so fast. In all the different movement vectors, vertical, horizontal, lateral, and rotational. And then consider step-up variations at all the various velocities and range of motion for sprinting. Bottom up partial squats at all the various velocities for starts. And then belt squats and flywheels are great for partial movements to avoid excess axial loading. So, it takes pressure off the spine if you use the belt squat when you're trying to do those heavy partials. And remember when I say the various velocities, if you watch a lot of the top sprint coaches, they'll have their athletes exploding into a certain range of motion at a step up. So definitely consider all of these suggestions. Now you'll see here, this is Ruby, and we were able to increase her jerk by almost 20 kilos in maybe 2 months simply by doing partial range of motion. So we do what we call jerk dip squats, which are basically fancy word for a front squat that's like just partial. It matches the range of motion they're going to do in the dip and drive for the jerk, and it equated to some massive results. So the way we use velocity, you're going to look at increases in peak force and time to peak force. That's very important. You can maybe increase your ability to produce force, but if it's slow to get there, it's no bueno. So velocity cutoff for safety. Using doing your heavy partials, but saying example, stay above 0.35 or above zero point 0.4 meters per second. Whether you're doing full range of motion or whether you're doing half, just gives you parameters to keep your athletes safe. The speed of the eccentric contraction to overload the eccentric potentially stimulating further elastic adaptations. Like just some people will try to overload their eccentric contraction by going super slow, but you're better off at going heavier but faster on the way down under control, because that's really what's going to really stimulate those muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and it's definitely more related to like athletic endeavors. That's why depth jumps are awesome for producing elastic improvements. Dip is that's actually a measurement of that distance in the eccentric distance to ensure specific comparisons are being made. Velocity of the partial step ups I mentioned will be crucial for application to sprinting, making sure that you're getting faster and faster at partial ranges of motion. Um, then application of range of motion authorization to strengthen power athletes, the jerk dip squats, which I mentioned. We also have done jerk dip squats, with bands. So, because, even though, you're doing the partials with the heavy weight and you're overloading that range of motion, once again, as she stands up, it's going to get easier at the hip. So it's going to be maximized at that power position, but you want to get, that whole range of motion. So by using the bands is a really good way of maximizing those partials. Heavy pulls from blocks to increase rate coding and motor unit recruitment at the top of a pull. We use these all the time, like by getting them used to really being able to go from 0 to 100 as fast as possible. Board presses, if you're doing bench pressing for a better lockout, maximizing the end range of motion on bench press. And then deadlift or clean lift-offs to strengthen pull it longer. Yeah, so it's not when you're doing partial range of motion. It's not necessarily through at that end or that top contraction part, but also you can do a partial where the muscle is fully lengthened. So think about doing a squat. You go all the way down, but you only come up maybe 8 inches. So it's a great way to really maximize that end range of motion if you're trying to strengthen it. So you just got to consider what's important. Like if you're not good at the beginning of a pull and a clean, or say the deadlift, then do just some partials from the beginning, or do a deficit like 2 inches below normal start position to like where the bar is right below the knee, and you just work that range of motion. So be creative. Use these principles to be creative. In conclusion, partial range of motion is great to create less sarcomeres in series and possibly more in parallel. Full range of motion does quite the opposite, adds in the series to max force at longer muscle lengths. Adaptations are specific to the joint angle. Use GymAware to measure rate of peak force, increases in peak force, eccentric velocity, overall velocity. And then tracking ensures consistent adaptations in the desired parameters. So email me, travis@gymaware.com, for any questions or any suggestions to topics in the future. Thank you.